The Crusades stand as one of history's most paradoxical conflicts, presented to the world as a sacred military campaign to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, yet driven by a constellation of hidden agendas, economic desperation, and political ambition. Between the late 11th century and the late 13th century, roughly 177 years of intermittent warfare engulfed the Mediterranean and the Middle East, claiming the lives of an estimated 2 to 3 million people. By any measure of military success, the Crusades were a catastrophic failure. The Holy Land remained in Muslim hands, Jerusalem was conquered and then lost, and the greatest beneficiaries were not the papacy or Christendom, but Venetian merchants, French nobility, and military orders that carved out their own power and wealth. It is a story about how the highest spiritual ideals were weaponized to serve the basest material desires. Contemporary chroniclers hinted at hidden motives. Muslim historians consistently referred to the Crusades not as a holy war, but as an invasion, and the final accounting reveals a stark truth. While peasants lost their lives and lands, the European elite accumulated vast wealth. On a cold day in late November at the end of the 11th century, Pope Urban II stood before an assembly of bishops and nobles at the Council of Clermont in south-central France. What he said that day, or at least what contemporary chroniclers reported that he said, would ignite nearly 2 centuries of warfare and reshape the medieval Mediterranean world. The official narrative claims that Urban II was motivated by humanitarian concern. For decades, he told his audience, Muslim Seljuk Turks had been closing off pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem, threatening Christian access to the holiest sites of Christendom, and the Byzantine emperor had requested military assistance. Therefore, Urban concluded, Christendom must launch a military recovery of the Holy Land. He promised something revolutionary to medieval ears. Participants in this holy war would receive plenary indulgences, complete forgiveness of sins, and in the minds of believers, a guarantee of paradise after death. The response was staggering and immediate. Within weeks, a mass movement had formed. Peasants driven by religious fervor and economic desperation began gathering under local leaders, and ruined nobles without inheritances smelled opportunity in the east. By the year 1096, tens of thousands of armed and unarmed people were heading eastward toward Constantinople and beyond. This was not a professional army, but a chaotic assemblage of the hungry, the homeless, the zealous, and the ambitious, united less by strategy than by myth and promise. Before the main crusading armies even reached the Holy Land, something unspeakable occurred along the Rhine River in the German lands. Between the months of May and July in that same year, organized groups of crusaders, incited by local preachers and driven by a brutal logic, launched coordinated attacks on Jewish communities. The reasoning was simple and murderous. Why travel thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ, when those enemies, as they imagined them, lived among them at home? In several cities along the Rhine, this idea took hold like a plague and turned neighbors into executioners. In the city of Mainz, approximately a little more than 1,000 Jews were killed. In Worms, around 800 died. In Regensburg, the Jewish community was herded into the river and drowned. In Rouen, almost the entire Jewish population was exterminated, and in Cologne another 600 were murdered. The total Jewish death toll along the Rhine exceeded 4,000 to 5,000 men, women, and children. Jewish chroniclers recorded the horror in stark language, determined that the memory of the slaughter would not be erased. One witness, Eliakim, wrote that there remained not one Jew in those cities, except those who hid themselves. After the Crusaders departed, the Jews of Regensburg performed a symbolic act of resistance by bathing themselves in the river without priestly blessing, a ritual unbaptism rejecting the forced conversions that had been imposed under the sword. The psychological mechanism behind these pogroms reveals something crucial about how religious ideology functioned in the medieval world. Crusaders had been taught that Muslims were infidel enemies of Christ, but they had also been taught that Jews were rejectors of Christ, and the mental leap from distant enemy to nearby enemy proved tragically easy. The wealth of Jewish communities provided a material incentive alongside theological justification. In many cities, persecution was followed by the seizure of property, turning religious violence into a form of robbery, sanctified by rhetoric. Yet, here is the strangest part of this early chapter of the Crusades. Pope Urban II had not called for the slaughter of Jews, and when later popes heard of such massacres, they issued formal condemnations, but the religious fervor they had unleashed proved impossible to contain. The pogroms were an unintended consequence of mass religious mobilization. Once the idea of holy war was let loose into the world, it followed its own logic, and the distance between papal intent and popular action became terrifyingly large. The early crusading movement was not homogeneous, and it unfolded in distinct waves. The first great wave consisted of what later chroniclers called the Peasant Crusade, led by three charismatic figures whose lives illuminate the mechanisms of mass mobilization. Peter the Hermit was a small, dark-complexioned monk of late middle age when he began preaching the crusade. His oratorical genius was such that crowds were said to pluck hairs from his mule as sacred relics, and he claimed to possess a letter from the Holy Sepulchre itself, authorizing the expedition. He traveled from town to town, gathering an army of perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people, mostly poor, many women and children, few with any real military experience. On the roads of France and the German lands, his name became a kind of living banner, drawing in those who had nothing but faith to cling to. Walter Sansevouar, whose name meant Walter without property, was a different type of leader. He was a ruined French knight, financially devastated and socially displaced, who commanded perhaps 6,000 crusaders and personified the class of landless knights for whom the Crusades promised an escape from poverty. His army, described by chroniclers as composed of the poorest of the poor, marched with little equipment and less discipline. For men like Walter, the choice was stark: remain in Europe with no land and no income, or gamble everything on conquest abroad. The third leader, Gottschalk, was a German priest who represented the spiritual authority within this first wave. He led approximately 15,000 people, again mostly peasants with minimal training, and clothed the march in a language of apocalyptic expectation. These three armies moved east in the year 1096, traveling through Hungary and the Balkans toward Constantinople. Along the way, they sustained themselves through pillage, their lack of supplies turning every village on the road into a potential target. In Hungary, King Koloman had them arrested for banditry and in some cases executed their leaders. In Bulgaria, Gottschalk presided over massacres of local populations, transforming the supposed army of Christ into a rolling catastrophe for Christians and non-Christians alike. By the time these forces reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was desperate to be rid of them. Fearing their disorder more than he valued their assistance, he hurried them across the Bosporus into Anatolia, into the path of the Seljuk Turks. What happened next was catastrophic and swift. On a day late in October in the year 1096, outside the city of Nicaea, the Seljuks annihilated the peasant crusaders, enveloping them with cavalry and cutting down exhausted and disorganized masses. Between 25,000 and 27,000 people were killed or enslaved in that single campaign. The slave markets of Anatolia suddenly filled with European captives, many of them sold for 3 to 5 gold dinars each, a bitter reversal of the Crusaders' dream of liberation. Contemporary chroniclers noted the irony with grim understatement. The Crusaders had come to free others from captivity, but had instead become slaves themselves, a pattern that would echo through later episodes of the crusading era. While the peasant crusaders were being slaughtered in Anatolia, a second wave of crusading armies was assembling further west. This one was composed of professional knights, nobles, and experienced military commanders, and its impact would be far more lasting and far more ruthless. The aristocratic crusaders included some of the most famous figures of medieval history. There was Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy who saw the crusade as an opportunity to carve out a principality for himself. And there was Raymond of Toulouse, an aging southern French noble seeking redemption and glory. Godfrey of Bouillon, a noble from the Ardennes, would become the first leader of the Crusader States. Tancred of Lecce, Bohemond's nephew, possessed both military talent and a reputation for calculated brutality that made him one of the most feared commanders of the age. These men were not driven primarily by pure piety, whatever they might have claimed. They were younger sons facing limited inheritance prospects in a feudal system that reserved most property for the eldest male heir, and the Crusades represented an opportunity to found dynasties and accumulate wealth through conquest. A landless second son in France could become a prince in Antioch or a lord in Jerusalem. The mathematics of ambition were irresistible, especially when combined with the papal promise of spiritual reward and earthly booty. The major aristocratic crusading armies converged on Constantinople in the winter, bridging 1096 and 1097. Emperor Alexios I viewed them with a mixture of hope and dread, needing their military assistance, but fearing their appetite for land and independence. He was right to be ambivalent. He extracted oaths of loyalty from several Crusader leaders, but he knew that once these armies crossed into Asia Minor, their obedience to Byzantine interests would be tenuous at best, and their loyalty to their own fortunes would dominate. The first major objective of the aristocratic Crusaders was the great city of Antioch in Syria. Antioch was one of Christianity's holiest centers, and its control would be both a symbolic and strategic triumph for the crusading movement. The siege of Antioch would last roughly 8 months, from the late autumn of one year to the early summer of the next. During that time, the crusading force, perhaps 60,000 strong at its peak, was reduced by combat, disease, and starvation to possibly 15,000 survivors. Chronicles describe warriors so hungry that they ate their own horses. When even that source of meat was exhausted, some accounts suggest darker rumors of cannibalism, though historians debate whether those reports were exaggerations or propaganda. Desertion was rampant, and morale was collapsing. Many Crusaders were openly discussing abandoning the entire enterprise and returning to Europe, convinced that God had forsaken them or that the task was simply impossible. It was at this moment of despair that a relatively obscure crusader named Peter Bartholomew came forward with an extraordinary claim. He reported that the Apostle Andrew had appeared to him in a series of visions, revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. According to Peter, the relic was buried beneath the floor of the Church of St. Peter within Antioch. The city's Muslim defenders, he claimed, had hidden it to keep its power from the Crusaders and to deny them divine protection. The Crusade leadership was desperate enough to entertain the possibility that this was a true revelation. A group of Crusaders began frenzied excavations beneath the church floor, digging deep into the earth in search of a relic that might save their cause. After hours of digging, Peter Bartholomew emerged holding an iron spearhead, announcing that the Holy Lance had been found. Whether the spearhead had been planted in advance or discovered by chance will never be known. But in that moment, the psychological effect mattered more than the archaeological truth. To many Crusaders, this discovery was a miracle, a sign that God had not abandoned them. Within days, buoyed by renewed faith, the Crusaders launched a determined assault on the city's Muslim garrison and eventually captured Antioch after a brutal struggle. Later analysis suggests that the victory was due less to divine intervention than to political fragmentation among the city's defenders and defections by some of the garrison. However, the belief in the lance transformed the Crusaders' sense of purpose and reinforced their belief in a supernatural destiny. The spear's subsequent fate adds another layer of ambiguity. It eventually made its way to Armenia, where it came to be housed in the monastery of St. Gegard, and to this day, the Armenian monks refuse modern scientific analysis, saying simply that they have no need of proof of its authenticity. After Antioch, the Crusaders' path to Jerusalem was open. Over the following months, they moved southward, capturing cities and fortresses and tightening the noose around the city that was the center of their religious imagination. By midsummer of the year 1099, they stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The city's garrison was relatively small, and the defenders were unprepared for the concentrated ferocity of the crusading armies that now encircled them. After a siege of several weeks, the Crusaders breached the walls. What followed was one of the most thoroughly documented massacres in medieval history, a climax of violence that shocked even some of its participants. The sources diverge on the number of victims. Western crusading chronicles speak of around 10,000 dead, while Muslim sources report figures as high as 30,000 to 70,000, and modern historians often estimate a range of 15,000 to 25,000. Eyewitnesses described unbelievable scenes of bloodshed. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers wrote that in the Temple of Solomon, which the Crusaders identified with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there was so much blood of the slain that it reached to the bridles of the horses. Fulcher of Chartres, another witness, wrote that some Crusaders cut off the heads of their enemies, others shot them with arrows so that they fell from towers, and still others cast captives into flames and watched them burn. The conquest of the Holy City became a theater of horror. The violence was not only directed against Muslims. Jerusalem's Jewish community fled into its synagogue seeking sanctuary, expecting that sacred space would grant them at least symbolic protection, but the Crusaders sealed the building and set it on fire. Almost the entire Jewish population of the city perished in the flames. A Jewish community that had existed in Jerusalem for centuries was effectively obliterated in a single day of misdirected religious triumph. This massacre raises a persistent question for historians. Was it planned or spontaneous? Some sources suggest that certain leaders, like Tancred and Godfrey, tried to offer protection to groups who had surrendered, but the scale of the killing indicates that whatever voices called for restraint were drowned in the roar of violent zeal. For decades afterward, the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 would be celebrated in Western Christian memory as a miraculous victory. In Muslim and Jewish memory, it would be remembered as an apocalypse, a moment when the language of holiness became cover for indiscriminate slaughter. After Jerusalem's conquest, the Crusaders confronted a practical problem that they had not fully anticipated. They had seized cities and lands, but they needed to govern them, defend them, and administer justice in a region far from their ancestral homes. Over the following decades, they created a patchwork of Crusader states across the Levant. These included the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli, each ruled by Crusader elites who transplanted European feudal structures into a Middle Eastern landscape. The Crusader states developed their own distinct culture. Crusaders who settled in the region often married local Christian or even sometimes Muslim women. Languages mixed, legal systems adjusted to local realities, and trade linked Europe, Byzantium, and the Muslim world in a complex web. For a time, these states achieved a precarious form of coexistence with their Muslim neighbors. Truces were signed and broken, alliances were made across religious lines, and in daily life, many inhabitants experienced a reality more nuanced than the grand rhetoric of holy war suggested. Yet, beneath the surface, structural weaknesses persisted. The Crusader states were always dependent on reinforcements from Europe, always outnumbered in the long run, and always vulnerable to the possibility that a strong and unified Muslim leadership might arise. That unified leadership emerged in the person of Saladin, a Kurdish general who would become the most formidable opponent the Crusaders ever faced. His rise marked the beginning of the end for Crusader power in the Middle East. By the middle of the 12th century, the Crusader states were increasingly isolated. Internally, they were riven by dynastic disputes and factional rivalries, and externally, they faced a Muslim world slowly coalescing under leaders capable of seeing beyond local feuds. Saladin's early campaigns focused on unifying Egypt and Syria under his authority. Rather than simply fighting local battles, he built a coherent political and military structure, recognizing that only unity could match the Crusader alliance. His genius lay in both strategy and image. Saladin pursued war with determination, but also cultivated a reputation for chivalry, honoring terms of surrender, treating many prisoners with relative mercy, and thereby contrasting his conduct with the remembered brutality of the Crusaders at Jerusalem. By the 1880s of the 12th century, Saladin had forged a coalition strong enough to confront the Crusader states directly. The confrontation that would decide their fate came near the Sea of Galilee, at a place called the Horns of Hattin. The Crusaders assembled an army of roughly 20,000 warriors, drawing heavily on their best knights and on the warrior monks of the military orders. Their aim was to force Saladin into a decisive battle and unseat his growing dominance. The decision to march toward Hattin in the blazing summer heat proved disastrous. The Crusader army moved across a waterless landscape with insufficient supplies, and men and horses alike began to succumb to heat and thirst before they even reached the battlefield. Saladin, by contrast, had arranged his forces to maintain access to water and secure supply lines. He ordered his men to harass the Crusaders with showers of arrows, avoiding close combat and letting the sun and the dust do their work. Crusader sources mention that 3 knights deserted and went over to Saladin's side, bringing detailed information about the Crusader army's condition and plans. According to these accounts, they told Saladin that the Crusaders were broken by thirst and exhaustion and that a vigorous attack would shatter them. When the time came, Saladin committed his forces to a full-scale assault. The heavily armored Crusader cavalry, already weakened, found themselves overwhelmed by waves of lighter Muslim horsemen and archers, their formations collapsing under the relentless pressure. The battle lasted around 7 hours, but its outcome was never in doubt once the Crusaders were penned in and deprived of water. By the end of the day, between 15,000 and 20,000 Crusaders lay dead, and another large number were prisoners. Muslim losses were relatively modest, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000. Among the Crusader captives were King Guy of Lusignan, the monarch of Jerusalem, and some of the most important nobles of the Crusader states, including the notorious Rhineland de Chatillon. Saladin personally executed Rhineland, fulfilling a vow he had made after Rhineland's earlier attacks on Muslim caravans. As one chronicler records, Saladin is said to have declared that this was the fate of a warrior who had violated truces and attacked pilgrims, The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Ridefort, was also captured and later killed. With their elite leadership decimated and their army in ruins, the Crusader states were left nearly defenseless. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating loss was that of the True Cross, the wooden relic that the Crusaders believed to be the very cross on which Christ had been crucified. It was captured on the battlefield and carried away, never to be returned to Christian hands. After Hattin, the collapse of Crusader power in the Levant was swift. City after city capitulated, and within months, Saladin moved against the ultimate prize, the city of Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem, now under Crusader control for nearly 9 decades, was ill-prepared for a determined siege. Many of its defenders had perished at Hattin, and its walls, though formidable, could not defend themselves without an adequate garrison. After a brief but intense siege, the city's leaders chose to negotiate. Saladin accepted their surrender and offered terms that stunned many who remembered the slaughter of 1099. He allowed many inhabitants to ransom themselves and depart in safety. Christians were permitted to leave with their movable property if they could pay the ransom fee. Those who could not pay often relied on wealthier believers or on negotiations that allowed at least some of them to avoid enslavement. The contrast with the First Crusader conquest of Jerusalem was dramatic. Where the Crusaders had waded through blood, Saladin offered a path of controlled, if painful, evacuation, and although there were exceptions and abuses, the general pattern was one of relative restraint. For Muslims, the recapture of Jerusalem in the year 1187 became a symbol of divine vindication. For Crusaders, it was a catastrophe, spurring new calls in Europe for another wave of holy war, the so-called Third Crusade. Yet none of the later Crusades would fully reverse the losses sustained at Hattin and in its aftermath. The balance of power in the Levant had shifted decisively, and the Crusader states would never recover their former strength. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th, the crusading movement did not end. Instead, it took a darker and stranger turn, culminating in a crusade that would never even reach Muslim lands, but would instead devastate a Christian empire. The Fourth Crusade began with noble intentions on parchment. Its goal, at least in theory, was to attack Egypt, the economic heart of Saladin's empire, and from there to recover Jerusalem and other lost territories for Christendom. To accomplish this, the Crusaders needed ships and supplies. They turned to Venice, the most powerful maritime republic of the time, and negotiated a contract for a fleet of around 50 to 60 ships, plus provisions for men and horses. The price for this fleet was set at 85,000 gold dinars, an immense sum. When the time came to pay, the Crusaders discovered they had drastically overestimated the number of volunteers and could not raise the money they owed. Venice now held them in a financial stranglehold. The city's doge, Enrico Dandolo, an elderly and blind but extraordinarily shrewd leader, proposed a way out. The Crusaders could work off part of their debt by helping Venice capture the city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. Zara was not a Muslim city. It was a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, himself a Crusader, and attacking it would mean turning weapons meant for infidels against fellow Christians. Yet the Crusaders were desperate, and many accepted the deal. In late November of the year 1202, the crusading fleet and Venetian forces attacked Zara. The city was bombarded, stormed, looted, and its inhabitants were killed or enslaved in scenes grimly reminiscent of what would later happen in Constantinople. When Pope Innocent III learned that Crusaders had attacked a Christian city, he responded by excommunicating them. Yet he also understood that he needed their military power, and before long he softened the punishment and sought to bring them back under papal direction. From this point onward, the Fourth Crusade was already morally compromised. It had shed Christian blood before ever facing a Muslim opponent, and financial necessity continued to dictate its trajectory more than spiritual conviction did. The next twist came in the form of an exiled Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos. His father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed by his own brother, Alexios III, and the young prince saw the Crusader army as a tool to regain his throne. He promised the Crusaders and Venetians a staggering package of rewards. If they would restore him and his father to power in Constantinople, he would pay them 200,000 silver marks, provide 10,000 Byzantine troops for the campaign to the Holy Land, and pursue church union with Rome. For a crusade already slipping under the weight of debt, this offer was irresistible. In the spring of 1203, the Crusader fleet sailed to Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, with banners flying and relics displayed. The city's walls were formidable and had repelled numerous sieges over centuries, but the combination of Venetian naval skill and Crusader land forces proved decisive. After intense fighting, the defenders faltered, and the usurper Alexios III fled. Isaac II was restored to the throne, and his son was crowned co-emperor as Alexios IV. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Crusaders had achieved a bloodless political miracle, and now awaited the fulfillment of the promised payments. Yet the Byzantine treasury was nearly empty. Years of warfare and mismanagement had drained its reserves, and the new emperors struggled to meet even a portion of their obligations, despite raising new taxes and melting sacred objects for bullion. The people of Constantinople quickly came to see the Crusaders as occupiers rather than allies. Riots broke out, resentment grew, and in early 1204, the young Alexios IV was deposed and murdered in a palace coup that also left Isaac II dead or incapacitated. Faced with the loss of their protector and still unpaid, the Crusaders and Venetians debated their next move. Some argued that they should cut their losses and leave, but others insisted that they were now entitled to take by force what had been promised in coin. The result was a decision that would change the course of Eastern Christian history. The Crusaders resolved to attack Constantinople itself, no longer in the name of restoring a legitimate emperor, but in the name of war booty and enforced settlement of debts. In early April of the year 1204, the assault began in earnest. Venetian ships, with specially constructed siege ramps, battered the sea walls, while Crusader forces attacked the landward defenses, combining technology and manpower in a relentless offensive. After days of fighting, sections of the walls were breached. Crusader and Venetian forces poured into the city, and resistance collapsed in a chaos of fire, fear, and flight. Constantinople, which had stood unconquered for roughly 9 centuries, fell to a crusading army. What followed was a sack of almost unimaginable scale. Contemporary observers describe how churches were stripped of their gold and silver, palaces were looted, and streets were choked with bodies and debris as soldiers ransacked every quarter that held wealth. The Church of Holy Wisdom, known as Hagia Sophia, was desecrated. Horses were led into its sacred spaces, altars were smashed, and priceless icons and mosaics were torn from walls and ceilings, some broken in the process, and others melted down for their precious metals. Royal palaces were emptied of treasure, and private homes were pillaged. Libraries that had preserved Greek and Roman texts for centuries were destroyed, either by deliberate burning or by neglect, as the Crusaders searched for more portable valuables. Robert of Clary, a Crusader who witnessed the events, wrote of his stunned amazement at the city's richness and of the shameless behavior of his fellow soldiers. he reported that nothing was spared. Sacred relics, nuns in their convents, and ordinary citizens all fell victim to greed and violence. The total plunder extracted from Constantinople has been estimated at around 900,000 silver marks. This was more than 4 times the amount the Crusaders had originally owed Venice, meaning that the Venetians and their Crusader allies profited enormously from the conquest of a Christian city. Venice, in particular, emerged as the unrivaled commercial power of the Eastern Mediterranean. It gained control of key ports and trade routes and transported numerous relics, artworks, and architectural elements back to its lagoons, where some still adorn churches and squares today. In the immediate aftermath, the Crusaders attempted to legitimize their conquest by establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople. A Latin emperor was crowned, and the city's governance was reorganized under Western rulers, though they never commanded full loyalty from the local population. However, the price of this new order was the destruction of Byzantine power. The old empire fragmented into a handful of successor states, including the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond, each with limited capacity to resist future threats. Although the Byzantine elite from Nicaea managed to recapture Constantinople in the year 1261, the restored empire was a ghost of its former self. Its territories were reduced, its treasury was depleted, and its ability to resist external enemies was permanently compromised. The greatest beneficiary of this weakening was not the papacy or the Latin Empire, but the rising Ottoman Turkish state. Over the next 2 centuries, the Ottomans advanced steadily, and in the year 1453 they captured Constantinople, completing a process that the Fourth Crusade had made far easier. The irony is sharp and inescapable. The Crusaders had set out to weaken Islam by conquering Muslim territories, but by destroying the Byzantine Empire, they dismantled a crucial bulwark that had checked Islamic expansion for centuries, thereby clearing the way for a new Muslim empire to enter Europe. While Crusader armies were fighting in the Levant and sacking Constantinople, new institutions were taking shape that would outlast many of the Crusader states. These were the military monastic orders, organizations that combined the discipline of monastic life with the violence of professional warfare. The Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar, was founded around the year 1119 by Hugues de Payens, a French knight. Its original mission was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land from bandits and hostile forces. Over time, the Templars expanded dramatically in size, wealth, and power. They established commanderies, fortified houses, and castles across France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Levant, building a network that spanned much of Western Christendom. By the 13th century, the Templars are estimated to have maintained more than 20,000 knights and sergeants. Their fortified properties functioned not only as military bases, but also as secure repositories for wealth and as centers of agricultural and commercial enterprise. As their economic activities expanded, the Templars discovered a new niche. They began offering financial services to nobles, merchants, and even kings, accepting deposits, transferring funds between distant locations, and extending loans secured by lands and castles. A pilgrim could deposit money with the Templars in Paris and receive a coded document allowing withdrawal of equivalent value in Jerusalem. This innovation reduced the risk of robbery on the roads and made the Templars indispensable to those with wealth and spiritual ambitions. As bankers and landlords, the Templars accumulated immense resources. Their success, however, made them a target, especially once the military justification for their existence began to erode after the loss of the Crusader states. By the year 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold at Acre had fallen to Muslim forces. The Templars withdrew primarily to Europe, where their castles and treasuries remained, but their purpose seemed less clear without a continuous holy war in the Levant. King Philip IV of France, called Philip the Handsome, was deeply indebted to the Templars. His wars and ambitious projects had drained his treasury, and he saw in the Templars both a financial problem and a financial opportunity. On a Friday in mid-October in the year 1307, Philip ordered the simultaneous arrest of Templars across France. Around 500 were seized in a single day, charged with heresy, blasphemy, and a host of lurid accusations. Under torture, some Templars confessed to spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and worshipping a mysterious idol sometimes called Baphomet. Whether these confessions reflected reality or the unbearable pressure of interrogation is doubtful, but they provided a pretext for Philip's plan. Over the next several years, trials dragged on. Many Templars were imprisoned, some were executed, and others recanted confessions made under torture, only to face renewed persecution. The order's reputation and institutional structure were slowly dismantled. The dramatic climax came in March of the year 1314, when Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned at the stake in Paris. According to some accounts, as the flames rose, he proclaimed his innocence and summoned both the king and the pope to divine judgment within a year. In a twist that medieval observers found impossible to ignore, Pope Clement V died a few weeks later, and King Philip IV died before the year's end. Many saw this as proof that Jacques de Molay's curse had taken effect, adding a final legendary layer to the Templars' story. Another great military order, the Hospitallers, followed a different path. Originally founded for the care of sick and injured pilgrims in Jerusalem, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem gradually took up arms and evolved into a powerful maritime and military force. After the fall of the Crusader States, the Hospitallers established themselves on the island of Rhodes in the eastern Mediterranean. From this base, they built a formidable fleet, constructed massive fortifications, and launched naval campaigns against Muslim shipping. For decades, the Hospitallers functioned as religiously sanctioned privateers. Their ships intercepted Muslim merchant vessels, seized cargoes, and disrupted trade routes, all under the banner of continuing holy war at sea. In the early 16th century, the Ottomans finally expelled the Hospitallers from Rhodes after a grueling siege. The order relocated to the island of Malta, where it once again fortified itself and resumed its role as a bulwark against Ottoman naval expansion. Unlike the Templars, the Hospitallers adapted to changing times and gradually shifted from military power to charitable and ceremonial roles. The order still exists today in modified form, focusing primarily on medical and humanitarian work. To fully grasp the nature of the Crusades, it is necessary to follow the money that flowed beneath the rhetoric of faith. Medieval Europe faced a profound monetary problem, a chronic outflow of gold and silver to the east in exchange for luxury goods. European consumers demanded spices, silks, precious stones, and fine metalwork from the Islamic and Asian worlds. Yet Eastern markets had little interest in European products, forcing merchants to pay in hard currency, which systematically drained Western treasuries. The Crusades offered a violent solution to this economic dilemma. By conquering ports and trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, European powers hoped to intercept and control the flow of goods, capturing profits that had previously gone to Muslim intermediaries. At the same time, the financing of crusading expeditions created lucrative opportunities. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa invested in fleets, supplies, and transport in exchange for commercial privileges and monopolies in newly conquered territories, reaping profits that could reach several times their initial investments. The papacy developed its own sophisticated financial mechanism in the form of indulgences. An indulgence was a formal declaration that a person's sins were forgiven, and the temporal punishment for those sins was reduced or removed. But in practice, it emerged as a tool for extracting money from the fearful. Priests and papal agents preached that sin led to eternal torment unless properly atoned for. Terrified believers, especially peasants, were urged to purchase indulgences as a way of securing their souls, often at the cost of selling land, livestock, or other property. The result was a massive transfer of wealth from the lower classes to the church hierarchy. As peasants parted with their land to pay for indulgences or to finance participation in a crusade, the church and noble families expanded their estates and tightened their control over rural populations. The economic calculus of the Crusades can be summarized starkly. For peasants, participation meant exposure to disease, hunger, and violence, with little realistic prospect of land or treasure at the end. For elites, funding and directing crusades could generate political prestige and substantial financial returns. Venetian investment in the Fourth Crusade, for example, required an outlay measured in tens of thousands of gold coins. The subsequent plunder of Constantinople and the capture of trade routes yielded returns several times higher, transforming Venice into one of the dominant commercial powers of the medieval world. By contrast, the average crusader who sold his fields to equip himself traveled thousands of miles and perished in battle or from illness, left nothing behind but debts and grief. His land ended up in the hands of monasteries, bishops, or wealthy neighbors. The Crusades thus functioned as a giant machine for redistributing wealth upward. Ideals of piety and salvation provided the ideological engine, but the gears and levers were economic interest, financial instruments, and calculated risks borne by those with the least to spare. As the 13th century progressed, the crusading concept expanded beyond the Holy Land. Popes began to authorize campaigns in other regions, arguing that fighting pagans or heretics elsewhere could earn the same spiritual rewards as fighting Muslims in Palestine. Nowhere was this expansion more visible than in the Baltic region. There, a series of conflicts, known collectively as the Northern Crusades, targeted pagan peoples along the coasts and forests bordering the Baltic Sea. The Northern Crusades followed a familiar pattern. Missionaries arrived first, blending genuine religious zeal with political reconnaissance. When persuasion failed, military orders and crusader knights arrived to enforce conversion and seize territory. The Teutonic Order emerged as the central crusading force in this northern theater. Formally approved by the papacy in the late 12th century, the order combined elements of the Templars and Hospitallers, but focused its energies on subduing the Prussians, Lithuanians, and other Baltic peoples. The conquest of Prussia unfolded over several decades at the turn of the 13th century. The Teutonic Knights, armed with heavy cavalry and fortified castles, advanced slowly but relentlessly, facing fierce resistance from local warriors who lacked comparable armor and siege technology. The demographic consequences were brutal. Estimates suggest that the indigenous Prussian population, perhaps around 500,000, was reduced by warfare, enslavement, and forced assimilation by more than half, with hundreds of thousands killed or absorbed into a new feudal order. In Prussia and neighboring lands, the Teutonic Order established not just forts, but a full-fledged state. Its capital at Malbork, with its massive brick castle, became the center of an extraordinary experiment. A sovereign polity governed by a religious military order rather than a hereditary dynasty. The order's rule combined the stern discipline of monastic life with rigid feudal hierarchies imposed on the conquered population. Pagan temples were destroyed or converted. local customs were suppressed, and Christianity was enforced through both preaching and intimidation. For a time, the Teutonic Order appeared unstoppable. It extended its control over wide swaths of the Baltic coast, founded towns, diverted trade routes, and attracted settlers from the German lands who were eager for new opportunities on what was presented as a frontier of faith. Over time, however, the order made powerful enemies. In the early 15th century, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, themselves newly Christianized and wary of Teutonic expansion, formed an alliance and confronted the order in battle. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Grunwald, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg, in the year 1410. The Polish-Lithuanian coalition inflicted a crushing defeat, killing or capturing thousands of Teutonic knights and breaking the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the order. The subsequent Peace of Torun forced the Teutonic Order to return some of its territories and pay significant reparations. From that point onward, the order declined in power and gradually transformed from a conquering force into a more conventional regional power. By the end of the 15th century, the age of crusading as a primary instrument of European expansion was drawing to a close. New technologies, especially the development of ocean-going ships capable of crossing the Atlantic and rounding Africa, shifted the focus of European ambition to other continents. When one examines the Crusades as a whole, from the first call of Urban II to the collapse of the last Crusader states and the fading of the Teutonic Order, a pattern of failure emerges. The explicit goal of permanently retaking the Holy Land for Christendom was never achieved. The Crusader kingdoms in the Levant survived for less than 2 centuries, a short time by the standards of medieval dynasties. By the year 1291, their last coastal foothold had fallen, and there would never again be a serious prospect of recovering Jerusalem by force. Meanwhile, the broader strategic landscape shifted in directions that contradicted the Crusaders' hopes. The Byzantine Empire, a crucial Christian bulwark, was fatally weakened by the Fourth Crusade and subsequent conflicts, and this paved the way for Ottoman conquest. In the year 1453, when the Ottomans captured Constantinople, they did so in part because the city was no longer the wealthy, resilient metropolis it had been before the Crusaders sacked it. The Crusades had undermined one Christian power while failing to permanently suppress Muslim power. It is thus not an exaggeration to say that the Crusades achieved outcomes opposite to their stated purpose. Instead of securing the eastern frontiers of Christendom, they contributed to the long-term shift of power that would eventually put a large part of southeastern Europe under Ottoman rule. Beyond the military and geopolitical outcomes, the Crusades produced deep cultural and psychological scars. For Western Europeans, the crusading era became a source of romanticized tales of knightly valor, pilgrimage, and adventure, often stripped of their darker realities. In the Islamic world, however, the memory of the Crusades was one of invasion, massacre, and desecration. The idea of European Christians as aggressors, and of Jerusalem as a city twice traumatized, first by Crusaders and later defended by Muslim leaders like Saladin, took firm root. For Eastern Christians, especially the Orthodox communities of the Byzantine world, the Crusades were remembered as a betrayal. The sack of Constantinople by supposed fellow Christians deepened the schism between Eastern and Western churches and made future theological reconciliation far more difficult. These competing memories still echo in modern politics and discourse. When modern leaders invoke the language of crusade or holy war, they tap into centuries-old narratives that different communities remember in profoundly different ways. Medieval theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas, tried to fit the Crusades into a framework of just war theory. A just war, they argued, required legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention, and by that measure they claimed that wars to recover Christian lands from Muslim rule were justified. Yet, the conduct of the Crusades tells a different story. The massacre at Jerusalem, the pogroms along the Rhine, the sack of Constantinople, and the forced conversions in the Baltic all raise serious doubts about whether right intention or proportionality governed Crusader actions. Even if one grants that some Crusaders were sincerely motivated by faith, it is impossible to ignore the role of greed, ambition, and hatred in driving events. The gap between theoretical justification and actual behavior was so vast that the moral edifice of just war theory appears hollow when applied to the crusading reality. The Crusades thus stand as a warning about the dangers of merging religious certainty with military power. When leaders claim divine sanction for violent projects, they create a context in which ordinary moral restraints are easily discarded and atrocities are excused as necessary steps toward a higher goal. The crusading era finally came to an end not because the medieval church repented of its methods, but because historical circumstances changed. As European powers turned their attention to the Atlantic, to Africa, and to Asia, the idea of marching armies overland to the Holy Land became less central to their ambitions. Gunpowder weapons, improved ships, and new trade routes made it possible to project power and seek wealth without the old apparatus of indulgences, preaching, and vows. The logic of conquest survived, but it took new forms in the age of exploration and colonization. Yet the legacy of the Crusades did not simply vanish. The patterns of thought forged in that era, the willingness to see other faiths as existential threats, and the habit of cloaking economic or political goals in religious language persisted in various guises. The Crusades' role as a great transfer of wealth from poor to rich, from laity to clergy, and from east to west also foreshadowed later episodes of imperial expansion. The techniques of financing, propaganda, and control, first refined in crusading campaigns, would be adapted to other contexts. To understand the Crusades fully is to see them as a convergence of genuine religious conviction and brutal material interest. The individual crusaders who took the cross often believed sincerely that they were obeying God, even as their actions served the designs of merchants, nobles, and prelates. The peasants who died at Nicaea, the knights who fell at Hattin, and the citizens massacred at Jerusalem and Constantinople were all caught in forces that they did not control. In many cases, their suffering advanced goals they would not have recognized as their own. The tragedy of the Crusades lies not only in their bloodshed, but in this misalignment between motive and result. Millions suffered and died, yet the outcomes favored a narrow elite and left the world more divided and embittered than before. In that sense, the Crusades remain an enduring lesson. They show how noble words and sacred symbols can be used to draw ordinary people into enterprises that are structurally doomed and morally compromised. And they remind us to scrutinize carefully any call to arms that claims to speak for God.